Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing a decision that's been recently released from the Supreme Court of Canada called Dickson and Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. This is a landmark case about whether Indigenous self-governments are subject to the Charter scrutiny. Now, the charity that I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, was an intervener in this case. And our concern was that the Charter should benefit everyone in Canada. There are no charter-free zones. The case is brought by an Indigenous woman named Miss Cindy Dickson, and it's brought against her band in the far north of the Yukon, Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. Miss Dickson wanted to run for band council, but her band rejected her candidacy because she lives in Whitehorse, not on the settlement land of Vuntut Gwitchin. So Ms. Dickson brought a charter claim for discrimination against the band. She claimed that the band was discriminating against her. Now, it's important here to know that Aboriginality residence is a basis for a Section 15 charter claim for discrimination. There's Supreme Court case law on that. But the Yukon Court of Appeal found that the charter doesn't apply to the acts of a self-governing First Nation because of a little considered section of the Constitution, Section 25 of the Charter. The Supreme Court has now concluded that Section 25 of the Charter does shield Indigenous self-governments from charter scrutiny, but only where there is an irreconcilable conflict between the collective right and the individual charter right, which in this case, the court found there was. But the dissent disagreed, citing arguments made by the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Now, here today to discuss the case are Joanna Barron and Josh DeHaas of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Josh, let's start with you. What more can you tell me about the background of this case? What do we need to know about Cindy Dickson and the story that led up to her claim against her band?
Well, Cindy Dickson lives in Whitehorse, which is about 800 kilometers from the settlement land of the First Nation that she belongs to, the Vuntut Gwetchin, which is much further. And they have a rule in their constitution that says you need to live on settlement lands if you want to be part of this government. That's a problem for Cindy Dickson because she needs to live in Whitehorse. She has a child who has a disability, and Old Crow is a very small village and it can't provide the medical services that she needs for her son. So she can't move to Old Crow to take up residency if she wants to run for and serve on the government there. So this is what makes it, a discrimination claim, and this is why discrimination entered into it.
Yeah, Joanna, is there anything you want to add to the background of the case here before we turn to Ms. Dixon's Section 15 discrimination claim?
Just as Josh mentioned, that Old Crow is a very remote community. It's a fly-in community, and it was obviously very remote from any type of essential services or medical services that in this case, Ms. Dickson was required to have access to. Also, the father of her son lived in Whitehorse, which I think also was a factor.
So she was arguing that prohibiting her from running for council because she lived in Whitehorse, that that's a violation of her Section 15 charter rights. And Section 15 guarantees your right not to be discriminated against on the basis of various protected grounds. No, it doesn't cite where a person lives. Aboriginal residency is not listed in the charter, but I did mention in the introduction that the question of whether an Indigenous person lives on or off reserve has actually been considered by the Supreme Court and found to be a ground for discrimination under Section 15. Joanna, in about a minute, can you explain that briefly?
Well, all of this actually dovetails a lot with something I think we're going to talk about more, which is the issue of gender, because it's come up because, of course, indigeneity is an immutable characteristic that doesn't depend on where you live, but many indigenous nations have historically have rules that have distinguished between individuals who live on and off reserve and have deprived certain privileges or rights, including customary rights, to individuals who move off reserve. And this is particularly affected. There's been a number of important Supreme Court cases about Indigenous women who have quote unquote married out, married non-Indigenous individuals and moved off reserve, and them being deprived of not just, privileges from the nation, but actually privileges from the government since they no longer live on reserve. And many of those have been corrected, for example, in a case called Lovelace, but it's a pretty fraught and complex issue.
Yeah, an issue that this case actually does intersect with. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.